Welcome back to all the attendees and our speaker. We will restart the second session of this morning of the first day. The first speaker of the second part is Professor Mara Thiene. I always hope to pronounce the name in the correct way. Sorry for that. Mara is professor at the University of Padova, is honorary professor at the University of Sydney in Australia. She has a long-term extensive research experience in applied economics with a specific focus on the environmental economics. So today she is the right person to talk to us about economic evaluation of environmental services, a demand-oriented perspective. So Mara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for this. I will need to ask the technician to move the slide, but anyway, I think we can manage. So let's start with the definition of environmental services and ecosystem services. So we all know that environmental resources are very much important because they typically provide a whole variety of different services. We can start with the provisioning services as we see in this classification that might be familiar to some of you. So provisioning services relate to, for example, water and food, that is what we eat, what we drink. But then there are other very much important services, that is the regulating services, for example. So the ability to sequestrate the carbon in terms of climate regulation. Also the ability to protect from storm or to prevent floods, so the moderation of extreme events, the ability to prevent erosion, and then there are the habitat services, and then last but not least are the culture and amenity resources. We typically have the opportunity, for example, to visit natural resources, mountains, lakes, the sea, and we go there for recreational opportunities. We go there for tourism. Think about the cultural cities. Also, we associate to natural resources spiritual experience, aesthetic experience. Next, please. So it becomes important to mainstream, to integrate ecosystem services into everyday life, so into the decision-making process in order to design and implement adequate policies. So we start with the ecosystem that we just saw. We know that from there we move to the via the biophysical models. We can calculate, we can estimate the amount of the services, and from there, and that's where economists jump in. And from there, by means of economic and cultural models that rely on econometrics, rely on mathematical modeling, we are able to estimate, to quantify the value of environmental resources in order to convey this information to institutions, to authorities, to government, so that they can design scenarios in order to put into actions the importance and the optimal use of environmental resources. Next, please. But what do we mean when we talk about economic value? Well, the economic value is typical the value that people attach to natural resources. In economics, in environmental economics, we have this term total economic value. It is basically an aggregated value made by two major components, the use values and the non-use values. There are several classifications, but more or less they can be boiled down to something similar to what I'm showing now. So in terms of direct values, we consider, for example, the services that are associated to resources that can be related to the recreation, as we were mentioning earlier. This is a direct value because we have a personal experience, a personal contact with the environmental resources. There are also indirect resource values, such as the regulating services that we were mentioning before, so water purification, flood prevention. This is an important category, but then there is another broad category that it's not necessarily linked to the utility that this service provides to mankind. There is the non-use value. It is an important component because it takes into account, it addresses, it acknowledges basically the existence value. There is the right of existence of environmental resources independently from the fact that we currently can benefit from this or other people can benefit from this. Typically, the total economic value needs an economic indicator, an economic aggregate to be quantified. The one that environmental economists typically use is the willingness to pay. That is the amount of money that people are willing to pay to preserve or to use different components of environmental resources. Next, please. So what I'm trying to do in this short presentation is to come up with some examples, some case studies that should hopefully show you how we can use economic values, how this can be considered useful tools in order to design successful environmental and policy strategies. So I have 4 case studies. The first 3 deal with the environmental amenities, and they focus more or less on protected areas, different types, different areas. And the 4th one gets back to food, more specifically, given also the context. Next, please. So let's start with the first case studies. It relates to a protected area, a park that's located in the Alps. As we all know, the Alps are typically able to provide a wide range of ecosystem goods. And those are important not also for tourists and visitors, but also for the local populations. These services deal with the beauty of the landscape, the possibility to display, interact outdoor recreation activities, but also important for cultural values, for the quality of the air. Typically, a park authority when dealing with their activity, they face 2 controversial decisions. On one hand, of course, they have to preserve the land and ecosystems, but on the other hand, they also have they're also asked to provide services to visitors and to possibly improve the quality and the quantity of such services. Also, we need to take into account that it's becoming more and more difficult to fund such services. And this has also to be contextualized into the incoming difficulty to receive more and more funds from the governments and from the authorities. Next. So in this case study, it relates to the natural park of the Regole d'Ampezzo. So you can see the beauty of the place. Many of you might know it. It is also listed under the UNESCO Heritage Sites. What we were doing here in this park was to collaborate with the park authority in order to try, in the attempt to answer to a list of questions that the park authority had. Next slide, please. So let me take the opportunity here to also tell you a little bit how we typically work. We collect data, so information, via individual questionnaires. That is, we design surveys and then we present these surveys to a fairly large number of respondents. This is important in terms of statistical inference, of course. So in this case, the question of the park authority was very clear. So the director said, you're not coming here to just collect a bunch of questions to the overall or general visitor. We want you to please select different types of visitors, because we think that each type of this visitor has different preferences and hence display different measures of willingness to pay. Hence, we focused on the hikers, but also on climbers, mountain bikers, and other types of activities. At the end of the data collection, what we typically do is to analyze the data via econometric models. Next, please. So we worked closely with the park authority. They were the one that were raising and soliciting us to focus on the characteristics of the place. So you can see here a list of site attributes. It starts with with the extent of network of trails, for example, and then it goes into details in terms of some types of itineraries, for example, thematic itineraries, or the managed excursion itineraries, or other issues like congestion, and we'll come back to this later on as well. Next, please. So after data collection, what we do is to estimate these models, which allow us to come up with the economic value that is associated to the attributes or services that are listed. So this graph reports the estimated marginal willingness to pay measures. As you can see, we came up with measures that are positive, but also negative. So, for example, I cannot now indicate, I think, but if you take a look at the first two bars, those are the thematic itineraries, that is the itineraries focusing on floristic trails or other characteristics related to the First World War. So people here were very clearly indicated that they are willing to pay up to €3 to have, for example, 5 additional thematic itineraries and up to €7 if they can have access to 7 additional thematic itineraries. How do we read the bottom part of the table that relates to negative willingness to pay? If you take a look at the columns, the histograms that are indicated with crowd 1 and crowd 2 on the left hand side of the table, you see that those are negative values. So they're very interesting because they are a clear indicator that people are willing to pay, for example, up to €3 to avoid a level of congestions that are specific to what we designed. So in this case, they're willing to pay up to €3 to avoid congestion along the trails that is associated up to 50 people. Interesting, they're willing to pay up to €7 if the level of congestion increases up to, for example, more than 50 persons. So those information seem to be very important in terms of policy management. Next, please. We now move to a scale up. That is, we have seen what happens at a point situation. Another study, the second one instead, tells us how to scale up result. This is another study that was focused on the Lombardy, so northern Italy, not far from where, of course, the EFSA is. It deals with 2 protected areas. The first one is the regional park of the Adamello, and the other one is the Ticino regional park. What we wanted to do here was exactly to scaling up, that is to move from point estimates to regional estimates. Next, please. Okay, so here's the methodology that we used. I'm not going into details. We first estimated our modeling, that is our willingness to pay estimates for the sample municipalities, and then by the benefit transfer, there is another methodology, we could scale up and extend the willingness to pay, that is the economic value, to the whole region. Next. Let me tell you why we selected those 2 parks. This is the map of the Lombardy region. This map reports not only the protected area in itself, but it reports all the sites of community importance and all the protection, the special protection areas. That is all the denominations, so to say, that indicate areas that need to be preserved. Next. These instead are the 2 areas that we picked. The Ticino was a plain regional park and the Adamello regional park. So if you go back to the previous slide, sorry, but okay, you can now have a clear understanding for the reason why we picked these two parks, because you see they're very much representatives of the overall area that are under conservation. Next and next. Next. Thank you very much. Okay, this is the list of the ecosystem services that we investigated here. So you can see for the Ticino Park on the right, we worked on the carbon sequestration, so different level of emission reduction. We also took into account the water quality, the biodiversity, the aesthetic values. In other words, a lot of the services that we encounter in the first slide that are typically indicated as ecosystem services. For the Adamello Park, on the other side, we work on slope stability, another very important one. And then, of course, also on fauna and recreation, and again, on the aesthetic value. Next, please. Some result. So here's the map of the Lombardy region. You see that there are colors that indicate the municipality. So the colors indicate the average willingness to pay values in the sampled municipalities. The average individual willingness to pay values are displayed in classes. So darker colors indicate positive values, where the red and the yellows indicate negatives. This is an interesting information per se, as indicate, for example, for the attribute slope stability, that is the extension, the kilometers of safe roads that are supported by stone walls. This is indicate basically the value, the economic value that the overall population of the Lombardy region attach to this specific ecosystem service. But even more interesting is when the next slide please, when we scale up via the benefit transfer and we are able to fill all the gaps, that is to fill the values for all the municipalities of the Lombardy region. So we see here, this is for another attribute, for example, transfer for the floristic trays, and we can see that all the municipalities are colored. We see, for example, that major urban center, like the one in the middle, sorry again, I cannot indicate, but the big blue one is Milan. So this display, I don't know whether the technician can indicate, there's a, in any case, okay, there's a big, okay, there's a blue big, a major big slot, that's Milan. So the major urban center display higher, thank you very much, higher willingness to pay and higher economic values, which makes sense because people living there have minor exposure and are, of course, and attach, of course, a larger value to these services. Next, please. Here's a picture of the park. So here's the first example. Here we wanted to look at two different research questions. First of all, I was mentioning it's different when you sample from on-site, that is, you address only the people that are, for example, there for a specific experience. This is different from off-site sampling, and it has important repercussion. And this is one of the first questions we want to answer here. And the second question relates to congestion. That's another issue that typically authorities need to manage. So let's move to the next slide. Here we're working with two different case studies. One is another park. This is the National Park of Dolomiti Bellunesi. This is the only national park in the northeast. This park has 7 recreational sites, but 2 importantly display issues in terms of congestion. And the name is Val Canzò and Val del Mis. It will come later on. Next slide. Okay, this is the list of attributes, so characteristics that we considered. So the number of bivouacs, the picnic sites, the information centers. Next, please. Okay, let's now try and answer the first research question. So the number of visits. Next slide. Okay, and next. Okay, fantastic, thanks. Okay, so here we have, we ask people how many times they visit, how many visits they took within the last 5 years. In terms of managerial management opportunities, this is very much important who has then to manage the area. So we have two samples here. We have the visitors, so the blue one, and then we have the overall population, completely different perspective. Why? Because the overall population, so the yellow one, takes into account not only visitors, but also potential visitors. So what we see here is, for example, that the blue bar has display, of course, 0 values for, there's not a bar for the 0 visit, because of course they all took at least 1 or more visit. Whereas when we take into account the Veneto population, so the overall population, we see that there is, of course, a fairly a fraction of the population who didn't visit. But take a look, it's only 30%. So it's only 30% of the overall population that never took any visit at the place. So this is quite important. And if we then take a look at the very right-hand side of the graph, we see that in both cases, so in terms of visitors and also in terms of the overall population, there is a fraction of 30% or 20% of the population who visit the place more than 10 times. So this is an information interesting per se for the authorities that take into this to be taken into consideration. Next. Now, how can we use these economic values and this information for managing? Okay, second research question. Can we do something basically to manage the flow of visitors, the flow of people? Can we use this information to redistribute visitors and, for example, make sure that more congested areas can be addressed and shift these people to less congested area? You might recall that this park had 7 recreation sites that are listed on the left-hand side. So what happens here, if based on the data that we collected, we increase, consider this policy scenario, we increase, for example, by 1 picnic area, a specific site, the site named Val di Lamen. And you move maybe, okay, and also then, okay, thank you, no, go back, sorry, thanks, okay, so if we can see that what happens if we increase by 1 picnic area in 1 place, so the Val di Lamen, we have a percentage change, a probability in terms of percentage change in visitation to decrease by 1.5% in the 2 more congested area, Val del Mis and Val Canzoi, with an increase in this Val di Lamen area. So basically the message is, it's very interesting because we can use the collected data to make policy, to simulate redistribution, to simulate changes, to simulate modification, not only in terms of distribution of the flow of visitors, but also redistribution and modification in terms of economic change. That is the value attribute to the places. Next one, please. I think we can skip, it's similar. And let's now move to the end because I think we're running out of time. So the last example deals with the premium price, so the economic value that people attach to food characteristics, in particular to collective reputations and to production methods. You can maybe move to the next. Okay, so what we're doing here was to compare and trying to estimate the premium price, so the willingness to pay for different production methods. We were interested into the integrated pest management, the biodynamic and the organic. This was done for carrots. We can move to the last slide, which is a histogram, which is a graph which displays on the x-axis the willingness to pay for organic, for this carrot produced in Val di Gresta. Why Val di Gresta? Because Val di Gresta is an alpine valley, was the first one to produce organic vegetables at national level, that is in Italy. So x-axis, we have the values the individual willingness to pay for organic, and on the y-axis, we have the willingness to pay for biodynamic. So there's plenty of information that can be that is conveyed by this figure. Basically, it shows, for example, now it's difficult. Can you maybe point out the center island? Yes, thank you very much. So, for example, this tells us there's a majority of people that is willing to pay €1, a premium price of €1 for the organic, and the same people are also willing to pay €1 in addition for the biodynamic. Instead, if you move down, you see that there is another fraction of people, so 20% or so, that's willing to pay, thank you very much, that's willing to pay 50 cents for the organic, but are not interested at all in the biodynamic because they're willing to pay is equal to 0. So thank you very much. I'm finished, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thank you for your presentation.